Blue Reflection is a video game, by Gust, published by Koei Tecmo in 2017 for the Sony PlayStation Vita, a version which was never released outside Japan. The English audiences got the PlayStation 4 version instead, and also as a PC port on Steam. Blue Reflection is a role-playing game. You play as Hinako Shirai, a former Japanese ballerina whose knee was ruined in an accident, and she had to leave dancing behind. She enrolls to a regular high school program, and isn't really sure what to do with herself now. Her two mysterious classmates, Yuzu and Lime, lead her into becoming a reflector, a sort of magical girl. The girls' school they attend is a sort of singularity point, where it's easy for the emotions of young girls to run rampant. When this happens, Hinako has to live in the common, a world embodying the emotional collective of mankind, and find the emotional fragments of her schoolmates, protect them from demons and stabilize them. I'll give the narrative some bonus points for how, despite having supernatural elements, the emotional turmoil of each student has to still be dealt with in real life as well, and isn't magically fixed by magic alone. Hina's job doesn't end there though. She also has to find giant monsters called Sephiroth. If they're allowed to reach this singularity point in the school, something bad will happen. She's got her hands full for sure. Her job is made easier by the fact that stabilizing fragments also enhances her magical girl powers, with the emotional strength of her schoolmates. Hinako is a very functional protagonist. She sparred her own life in the ballet to such an extent that she's ended up somewhat socially awkward even. She has good manners and all, but has some trouble understanding other people's emotions and thoughts. As a reflector, she is pushed into interacting with others and literally forcing her way into their hearts. In doing so, she ends up helping other people and befriending them, but also understanding herself better and growing as a person. She may seem like an unentertaining character, but her apparent blandness isn't from a lack of skilled writing, but an intended part of her character development. She's genuinely earnest and tries her all for the best solution for everyone, even when she's pretty lost herself. And seeing her grow is satisfying and inspiring. Yuzu and Lime, the other two playable characters, don't exactly receive as much focus and development. For story reasons that I won't elaborate on, perhaps it's fitting. Yuzu is the more energetic and empathetic of the two twins, while Lime is more pragmatic and calm, and even outright cruel sometimes. They're not perfect people, just like you should expect from any teenage girls, despite their role as guides in the story, but their bond with Hinako still feels true. The rest of the cast with actual names and faces are supporting characters, various schoolmates that Hinako helps and befriends over the course of the story. They all have their little troubles, like Sarasa, who used to be Hina's rival in ballet, but now has to figure out her motivation for the art all over again. Fumio, who's trying to improve her piano play, but is inspired by her IT firm CEO father's crunch culture, which is obviously not a good idea. Or Kei, whose overly outgoing and outspoken attitude are difficult to deal with by her peers. There's a lot of other characters who are more interesting to meet in game than hear me list out one by one. Over the course of the game, Hinako has to deepen her bonds with her friends. This is done by talking with them on her phone chat or going somewhere with them after school. Once their bonds grow strong enough, you can see the characters' side events. In the main story you deal with some of their personal issues, and the side story generally extends her personality into a conflict with her peers in school, and resolving the misunderstandings and differences in perspective between the parties. These events are usually decently written and have a good idea behind them, but they're also pretty brief and the presentation remains somewhat weak and rushed, burying the build-up and gravitas somewhat. To some extent this is affected by pacing, the control of which is greatly thrust upon the player themselves. If you simply follow the main story and complete regular missions during daily life, there's not much else left to create a fitting rhythm between the main and side content. The player has to go out of their way to not progress the main story and spend some time with Hinako's friends. The game encourages this by telling you to strengthen these bonds, but it's difficult to understand the actual mechanics behind the system. If you report your mission activities to Yuzu and Lime, the main story will progress the next day. If you refrain from doing this, you can repeat your days as much as you want. Progressing the main story too quickly will pile up character events too close to each other, and that makes their pace too fast. But the same thing can happen if you don't progress the main story either, as specific character levels are required to progress the main story, and that requires Hinako to hang out with her friends. It's neat that the game trusts the player to pace their campaign, but it's also too much responsibility. Player-reliant pacing requires a lot of effort, planning and testing from the developers themselves, something that clearly didn't get much time spent on it. The game could use some sort of calendar system where the days and various events are given a better rhythm, which would protect the player from destroying the pacing for themselves. Beyond that, the characters' issues reflect actual social problems quite well. Bullying is often involved, particularly in situations where someone's goodwill is seen as a pretense or glory-hogging. There's a clear theme of perspective to the narrative, how people can easily mistreat others because they don't understand their intent and motivations, and how trying to understand others and put effort into communicating with them can prevent it. There was one character side story where a certain character gets pretty pushy and doesn't respect another person's physical and emotional boundaries, practically sexual harassment. And it would be fine as a story element if it was addressed with proper seriousness and something the characters actually learn from, but to some extent it's played off too much as a joke. This kind of treatment cheapens the feelings of the characters involved, and I'm disappointed that potentially tender and engaging character interaction and themes were executed in this way. Fortunately, there's nothing as serious in the game outside this one specific case, but it's still worth mentioning and criticizing. The main plot overall isn't all that complex, or doesn't even require much to actually tell. There's a couple of key plot twists in there that definitely work much better when time is spent more on things around the story, but the main storyline is still definitely very short and kind of rushed even. Days pass at a rather rapid rate and it can make the experience feel a little oppressive or awkward, which I doubt is what the developers wanted. To me, it seems like Hinako's days in school should be an uplifting experience for both her and the player. The final of the game, however, is very emotionally impactful, and it's not so in a cheap way. But it does require being invested in the characters, something that can easily fail, especially if the player doesn't manage to pace the game well for themselves. I think I said earlier that the presentation is awkward. Sometimes the game doesn't do anything with ambient sound during story events, even when it's already used that before when you walk around the school by yourself.
勝負中ずっと。さて。謝るって？
That and the game constantly swapping locations with barely any proper transition between scenes can make it feel a bit uncanny. The camera also does really weird and amateurish panning every now and then, which looks silly even by low-budget RPG standards. Leaps into common are very brief tasks, whether it's a part of the main story or side content. The common consists of 4 differently themed areas, which consist of a few different maps that the game seems to shuffle for you. The actual dungeon layouts are very simple. Your objective usually involves picking up items which triggers finding the fragment you have to stabilize, or to simply defeat specific enemies. There's an attempt at swapping the scenery with the different emotional themes of the common, and an attempt at establishing a contextual meaning for the dungeons. But there's so little effort to it that I don't blame anyone for finding the dungeons tedious and repetitive to go through. Defeating enemies doesn't grant any experience points. You actually gain levels from character events, though it's limited to level 50, and there's a lot more events than that. Emotions are the source of power for a reflector, so this makes sense in terms of narrative, but it's definitely less motivating to fight enemies when you won't get any experience out of it. There's still reason to fight enemies for items they drop, which are needed for crafting items, some that are needed for quests, and some are needed to enhance your fragments. Fragments are like accessories that you equip to your skills to increase their power, or grant them extra traits. Sometimes the game is an ass though, and doesn't give you any loot from a fight at all, making some fights completely pointless. The combat system is a turn-based one. You mostly use different skills to attack, each having their own damage attribute to it, with enemies having strengths and weaknesses to different ones. Besides that system, there's a timeline that each unit in battle slides on to get to their turn. Certain skills can knock units back on the timeline, and different skills cause more delay on the timeline than the others. Your skills also cost magic points, but each character can spend some time to recharge it. So the battle becomes a matter of deciding whether you want to prioritize damage or keeping the enemy at bay by knocking them back, and controlling the resources needed to accomplish both. It's a good system, but it does involve some empty waiting, something the sequel fixed a little by making the timeline move even when characters are executing their skills. With this game, you have to wait for a unit to get to its turn, then for them to pull off their skill animation, some of which take a little bit long. The animations are nice for sure, but they can get repetitive to look at. Combined with the constant common leaps with simple objectives and inconsistency in rewards with only getting materials you may or may not have a use for, it can be a bit tiring to go through battles often. But at least the music is damn good.
何をしようかな。ほらこれ。いけ。どうしよう。いや頑張らないと。
The combat system shines a little bit more when fighting the Sephiroth. These boss battles always have multiple phases, and there's several targets to consider. The economy and strategy game gets a little more engaging, since the bosses also have some extra parts that can do attacks of their own, so keeping them at bay can sometimes work in your favor. Your schoolmates can also participate as support that you can summon at specific moments for some extra damage or buffs. Having a lot of their animations pile up can also be somewhat tiring to look at, and it's not necessarily a choice of whether you want them there or not, because even if their buffs or damage are not needed, their every support ability increases your current ether count at least. Ether is another battle resource, and it's used for timeline skills or to power up overdrive. Timeline skins are used while waiting for a unit to get a turn, to for example slow the enemy down or to heal your party's HP and MP, and so on. Overdrive allows you to exchange ether for extra actions during a turn. They are all very useful and outright necessary mechanics to make use of, so having as much ether as possible is very desirable. Overdrive does end up somewhat trivializing boss battles eventually. At some point you unlock overdrive specials, which are very powerful attacks that are triggered when you do a 3 overdrive combo. One overdrive special ends one phase of a Sephiroth fight, so you pretty much have to execute only 3 of them. It's pretty easy to pull off and maybe the fastest method, so I don't really know if there's a reason to do anything else. I guess you can play around with the system otherwise, but some bosses have very annoying status ailments, like Confuse, that you'll get hit less by the faster you end the fight. Also I played on normal, so I'm not sure how demanded fights are on hard. I'm not a fan of difficulty modes. Each boss has their own musical theme and a different movement for each phase of the fight. It really elevates the fights into something more grand, even if you're easily kicking their asses. The music in both Blue Reflection games is fantastic. Hayato Asano has done a great job as a composer. The upbeat DTM works really well for battles, and more emotional element tracks led by piano and violin hit just right. Even if you're not going to play this one or the sequel, at least listen to the soundtracks. They're great.
お願いね。これなら跳ね返せる。
Looking at footage online, the PlayStation 4 version of the game seems to struggle a bit with keeping up a stable frame rate. The experience is considerably smoother on PC, as long as you have the specs for it. And if you want to play the game on Steam Deck, it's very much possible via Proton GE. And the game seems to run well, but there are some bugs with sound not playing right at times. The Vita version looks like it runs about as well as most Vita games do, sub 30 frames per second. Resolution and texture quality are considerably lower than on PlayStation 4 and PC, and the glossy shaders are gone. There's no official English release for the Vita, but the official translation appears to have been file patched for the Vita version, if that's what you prefer. Speaking of the localization, the script seems decently written, but there's a lot of typos and text formatting errors. In my opinion, these are usually the least offensive mistake in a translated script, but there are so many in this game that it becomes a small nuisance. One final thing to address to this game is related to its reputation. Blue Reflection gets some bad rap for fanservice. I will now proceed to piece off both of the camps surrounding this discourse. I think sexual fanservice can be a fun thing sometimes. Sometimes it cheapens the experience. It depends on the context and execution, really. But I also sincerely hope you're not a porn addict, because if you're specifically demanding for sexual content from your video games, you might want to seek some help. I'm also not going to deny anyone's negative experience with the fanservice in relation to this game, but it is a very subjective matter. Blue Reflection is a little mixed here. The more obvious side of it is just some bad scenes, innocent unless you can stand seeing characters partially naked on the screen. Plus you can simply choose to not see those scenes. Besides those, there's some custom DLC that you can obviously just pass on. Now the weirder part is more subtle. Apparently spearheaded by Mel Kishida, the illustrator and supervisor for the game, he encouraged some of the staff to talk about their fetishes and they snuck some of those into the game. You might not notice anything during a whole playthrough, or maybe you will. I think it's better to not pay attention to it. You can make Hinako take a bath every evening and you can pass that off as a normal everyday thing, but it may also mean something more to someone in Gust. Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? I know it's damn weird for Hinako to leave her underwear on the bathroom floor, instead of using a laundry basket. I don't know who gets off to that and whether the idea haunts me as much as making a character act like this for the sake of it. I appreciate Kishida as an illustrator, but I'm pretty glad that he wasn't involved in Tai beyond the character designs, even if I wasn't bothered by this stuff too much in this game. Anyway, Blue Reflection at least deserves to be noted for being a rare magical girl RPG. There's not that many out there as far as I know. Its gameplay content can be tedious, its presentation can be awkward, and it's not necessarily a game I'd recommend. But under these issues, there's a strong heart and soul to it, and I at least feel satisfied with the game in the end, thanks to the powerful ending. If you're not interested in the first game but want something similar, check out the sequel. You don't really have to play the first one to enjoy it. If you played the sequel, but are uncertain about this one, if you like Hinako a lot, you should play her game anyway. And if you don't like her, remove yourself from the premises immediately. Hinako is precious and you should want to adopt her if she had the need for it. I don't make the rules here, but I will enforce them. See you again.